Well, thank you for joining us today, both here in the room and online, for our session that's called Peace Finance, the Case of Renewable Energy. I think it's already very exciting to see friends and colleagues from both who are working on the energy transition, who are working on sustainable finance, and who are working on peace building in this room today. So I think an important relationships has already been built. I will avoid the word bridges. I think that has been overused the past 3 days. Why are we here today? I think to achieve the Paris Agreement and the Millennium Development Goals, it will require, among many other things, a greater inflow of private capital to fragile and conflict-affected countries. We're already seeing a booming mining and minerals sector in some of these difficult markets. And we will also urge in today's discussion for more private investment in renewable energy projects in these difficult contexts. I think to enable the energy transition will require a significant increase in the demand for metals and minerals. I think for some it will go up with almost 500%, and some of these minerals are only being found in fragile and conflict-affected countries. I think if we look at platinum or cobalt coming from DRC, but also we run as a Peace Nexus Foundation, we run projects in the Sahel and in West Africa, and we see an enormous mining boom taking place, which influences conflict dynamic as well. Maybe before I continue, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Johannes Schreuder. I'm leading the business engagement work of the Peace Nexus Foundation, and I will briefly introduce the rest of our experts to you as well. And on the renewable energy side, almost 600 people without access to electricity live in fragile and conflict-affected settings. So these people will need access to energy in the coming years as well to achieve the access to energy development goal, but also if they don't immediately step into clean forms of energy, it can lead to a new boost in emissions. So there is a need for accelerated private investments in these markets, also because of the fiscal space is extremely limited. So private financiers need to step up. Unfortunately, new flows of investments in this context have led to increase in conflicts. More money is going around, tends to increase existing conflict dynamics. I think this is getting worse because of global warming. It's putting more stress on these countries, so it will become more difficult to operate in a conflict-sensitive and responsible way in these markets. But there's no other choice than to do so because we need this inflow of capital. In today's discussion, we will share some findings from a report that was developed by the Peace Nexus Foundation and IGC on conflict-sensitive renewable energy in fragile states. We will get an industry perspective on how you can deploy renewable energy projects in even the most difficult markets around the world. We will learn more about the SFG Peace Finance Hub and its implication for the finance industry. And we will also see, okay, what's happening at the regulatory level. What is the EU doing and how is the EU encouraging companies to enhance their due diligence activities in fragile states. It's a pleasure to introduce the panel to you. Next to me is Amna Mahmoud, who's researcher for the International Growth Center and who was instrumental in developing the report that I just mentioned. Next to her is sitting Kristen, who's business development manager of Cube Energy. And Cube has, as I mentioned, deployed renewable energy projects in most of the difficult places in the world, Somalia and other countries, but I'll let Kristen speak more about that. Josie, welcome, is the CEO and founder of TrustWorks Global, and they are advising companies and investors to operate in a responsible way in this very difficult context. And finally, Dominique, welcome as well. He's the Chief Sustainability Officer of PPT, a Geneva-based asset manager, and he was the driving force behind the SFG Peace Finance Hub that was launched on Tuesday. So I hope some of you were able to participate in that discussion as well. We also value to have somebody from an affected community being on the stage here today to really explain how it is for communities that are affected to when they experience a big inflow of capital, when large infrastructural projects are taking place. But unfortunately, that was not feasible. But I want to start the discussion with some of the concerns that are top of mind from their side, and then I will hand over to Amna to share a bit about the report that was recently launched. The lady we spoke to was Purity Gaku. She works for Impact, a civil society organization in Africa, and she's also representing affected communities in both Kenya and Ethiopia. And she said, like, the loss of land is the primary concern of affected communities. And when she spoke about geothermal projects, which large-scale projects are being deployed now in Ethiopia, she said there's a lot of air pollution and soil pollution related to these projects, and there's an increase in skin diseases and miscarriages in the affected communities as well. So she wants that's top of mind of investors as well. And she also mentioned that these new investments are a catalyst for existing conflicts between communities and within communities. So it's fuel, it's more fuel on the fire. When there are tensions in the communities, when more capital comes in, it creates additional tension. She also mentioned, like, community members lack sufficient information of the projects and any of the agreements that has been made with the authorities. If there are avenues to make complaints, the legal burden is extremely difficult for affected communities. It exposes them to lengthy court battles, hefty legal fees in order to pursue justice. And I think this is really where there's the imbalance of power between affected communities and these large players that are coming into these markets. We also asked, okay, what kind of guidance or what kind of points would you like to share with investors and companies that are present at the conference? Well, she said, okay, try to negotiate as much as possible with the affected communities themselves and not only with the national authorities. I think often the local communities are being involved in the process later on once the agreement has been made, and she said, okay, bring them into the discussion at an earlier point in time. She also said, okay, communities and investors should also ensure to the best of their abilities to make the group that they're engaging with inclusive, not only the village chief or certain community representative, but really make that a broader group of individuals. And what also struck me was the final point she made was that corporate social responsibility is not an alternative for fair compensation. Compensation schemes should take into account the loss of livelihood of affected communities currently, but also on the long run. And I think that's where tension arises, where it's, okay, we are being involved for corporate responsibility projects, but not at the core point in time when agreements are being made, when compensation schemes are being identified. And I think that's where we want to bring in. But maybe, Amna, you can share a little bit about what you found during the research project. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. Thank you, everyone who are in this room for this session. So today I'll be talking about the work that we did at the International Growth Center with Peace Nexus Foundation and ECRIS. We looked at the impact of renewable energy projects in fragile and conflict-affected states. So the reason we were motivated to do this work really is that the electricity access challenge in these settings is profound. So 42% of the population residing in these settings do not have access to electricity. And this is a figure that's been quoted by the SMAP Tracking SDG 7 report, the latest report that came out. So just for perspective, I'm putting up this visual which shows the list of countries which World Bank has classified as fragile and conflict affected. And this is last year's list, so every year the World Bank updates the list. But the countries are, as you can imagine, in fragility and conflict, they're mostly the same. Fortunately, the good news is that these settings have very impressive renewable energy potential. So this is a visual of the global horizontal irradiation, and simply put, it means the darker the region, the more potential it has for solar energy. So if you superimpose, the map that I showed you of the fragile and conflict-affected states on this, you would see that there is an overlap with solar energy potential. And this second visual shows hydropower potential, and you'll see a similar trend here. Unfortunately, the challenge is that the countries, the governments in these countries, they do not have the fiscal capacity to meet this, to bridge this electricity access gap. And hence, private investments are just not necessary, but they'll be essential if we have to work towards achieving the universal electricity access by 2030. So the aim of our work was really to understand the impact of renewable energy projects on peace and conflict dynamics when these projects are deployed in fragile and conflict-affected states. And one of the main challenges that we faced, as you can imagine, was lack of reliable data or evidence already that existed. So our research was limited to literature review and interviews and consultations with people who are in these sectors. We looked at different renewable energy sources. So we looked at solar, wind, and hydro. And we looked at a range of countries, but specifically we focused on Democratic Republic of Congo, Western Sahara, and Ethiopia. And what we found was that these projects did lead to positive socioeconomic benefits beyond simply electricity access. So some of you may have heard the term electricity access as an enabler, and what that means is electricity access is essential for achieving other development goals. So for example, if you talk about education, access to electricity allows school children to study longer. They allow health centers to have refrigeration facilities to store medicines and vaccines. And then they also save women time from, let's say, doing household tasks like going and collecting water or firewood. So they also increase income-generating opportunities and strengthen livelihoods because businesses were also able to operate during nighttime. It also led to local skills development where the project operator or developer invested in capacity building of local technicians or engineers. And it also improved the perception of individual level of safety where the project led to initiatives like public street lighting. But at the same time, there were negative consequences that were also observed, and these are very pertinent in projects that were built in historically marginalized areas or on disputed territories. And these reinforced existing inequalities and exacerbated community grievances. They violated human rights, and they worsened local conflict dynamics. Okay. And the reason these negative consequences occurred were because there was a mismatched expectations, there was misalignment of expectations, and where the revenues generated from the project were not really then invested back into the local communities and into local developments. So expectations were misaligned where free, prior, and informed consent was not sought from the local communities. or when the communities did not really realize earlier on what they were being asked to forego. So to give you an example, these pastoralist communities, they're affected when these areas are cordoned off or barricaded where the projects are located. So because they're used to mobility, they're used to having livestock graze lands freely, it affects their livelihoods. It affects their ability to earn sustainable sources of income. And then issues also arise when the projects compete for scarce resources which the communities rely on, such as water. So another point of contention was that the electricity generated was not made available locally to the communities, but it was actually transferred outside or transmitted outside of the area. So it was made available for industrial or commercial uses, but not for local communities. And when it was made available to local communities, the price was so high that they were not able to afford the electricity. So grievances also arose when employment opportunities were short-lived. For example, they were only made available during the construction phase, and it didn't really lead on to sustainable sources of income. Or when the employment opportunities were not made to local communities, but you had work from outside of the community come in and work on the projects. And lastly, this is something, of course, which Johannes also touched upon. The communities that were displaced or resettled as a result of the project, they were not adequately compensated for the potential loss of livelihood that they experienced, that they previously relied on. And I think one important thing to point out here is that large-scale solar, wind farms, as well as hydropower plants, they're very land-intensive, and this is usually the land that local communities use for their subsistence, either through agriculture or through grazing of their livestock. So based on these findings, the report presents a few recommendations. So it highlights the importance of integrating conflict sensitivity throughout the life cycle of the project. And conflict sensitivity can have multiple interpretations, but broadly what it means is the approach that is undertaken, it does not unintentionally contribute to the local conflict, but rather it strengthens opportunities for peace. So in other words, the project developers should not factor in just how the conflict would affect their operations, but also how their operations can end up affecting prevailing conflict and fragility conditions. So this is the understanding that this is a two-way interaction. So there are existing tools and instruments for conflict sensitivity, and usually they involve undertaking conflict assessment, conducting local context analysis, stakeholder mapping, conflict screening, understanding the key socio-political trends. And this usually takes place at the start, or it should take place at the start of the project during pre-feasibility or the feasibility phase, and then developing a comprehensive risk mitigation and management framework for the duration of the project. So again, just pointing out to what Johannes mentioned, so it's very important to continuously and meaningfully engage with the community. So renewable energy projects, even if you're talking about like small-scale solar mini-grids, these are infrastructure projects, so they have a lifespan of 20, 25 years or longer. So the engagement with the community has to be long-term. It needs to be a long-term relationship building. Oh, I think I've moved ahead. Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is something, the next point is something we've heard over and over again in the conference, the need for investors to increase the flexibility, duration, and risk tolerance of their capital, so that project developers are able to actually inbuild conflict sensitivity measures into their project. And lastly, it's just very important to share learnings as well. So it's important to know what's worked and what is working, and we won't be able to do that if we don't know what has not worked. So it's important to have some transparency around these projects. And then lastly, to move forward, oh, am I going back? I'm so sorry. Yeah, so there isn't any evidence generation around this. We need to do more rigorous evidence generation, and we need to understand how they adversely affect the local community dynamics, the local conflict dynamics, and lastly, just a message to conclude that as we transition towards renewable energy, it is critical to ensure that these transitions are just and beneficial for all stakeholders. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna, for this very rich presentation. I think a lot of information to digest. And also, I hope it encourages investors and companies to, be more attentive to conflict dynamics when they enter into one of the markets that we discussed earlier. But one company that did step in and stepped in successfully is Cube Energy. So maybe Kristen, can you share some of your experience of entering in these markets?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I think I just need the remote control that is over there. Yeah. Thank you. So, I mean, let me say a few words about Cube Energy first. I think, Cube Energy is a pretty young company. Can you just maybe switch to the other presentation? Oh, yeah, sorry. It's a pretty young company. It's been set up in 2016, and I think mostly the staff from the company have their background from the humanitarian and developmental sectors. So I think it says a lot about the spirit in the company. The main objective of the company is to provide renewable energy infrastructure to the most remote and fragile locations across the world, and especially in Africa. I think the map that has been shown earlier is more or less where we actually work. But right now we have projects in Somalia, South Sudan, Central African Republic, and we hope to expand also to Mali. But I think a common feature among these locations is first the fact that there is more or less no or limited energy infrastructure, and there is a high price, for electricity, and lastly, despite all of that, there is still, a very good potential, even great potential for solar power. So you can tell me, why we're not actually investing, that much money into this context where, you do have an opportunity. But, despite the significant demand, I think, the conflict areas and fragile areas in general are, sort of not very attractive to investors, and actually are considered as too risky and too complex for investors. And I think barriers like political instability, weak governance, corruption, and also land tenure that was came from your study. I think that barriers that prevent deter investors to come into this market, despite maybe the attractivity, the commercial attractivity. But I think I think let me probably give you an example of what we have done. Just gonna go straight to this one. Let me take you to Baidoa, which is a city, regional capital city of a conflict-affected country in Somalia, and I think Baidoa is very representative of the size of potential market where you can develop solar infrastructure. But there war, climate change, and extreme poverty have displaced thousands and thousands of people. You have actually more than 300,000 IDPs spread across the city, and you do have limited energy infrastructure. You do have a couple of diesel genset operators that run mini grids, very limited grids that actually power a couple of business, shops and some residential, areas. But the price is pretty high. It's around 90 cents, maybe $1 per kilowatt hour in this location. But these operators don't have any access to capital, and they don't have the technical expertise to build sustainable infrastructure for the city. So I think the city has grown at great speed. You have a city that has more than 600,000 people, but you don't have any energy infrastructure. So people usually run their own diesel generators to power the house, or they don't have actually access to electricity, and that's it. So I think ourselves, Cube Energy, we started to work in Baidoa back in 2018, and we have initiated this project to build a solar power plant that ultimately will provide electricity to the communities. And this project was, is actually financed by one of our partner, Cross Boundary Energy, that is a very flexible and patient, investor. And this is what you need in this kind of context. I think, this will be the first ever, solar hybrid power plant built there, and it will be the largest investment, foreign investment, into the country in the energy sector. So it's quite, a first. And let me tell you how we managed to sort of like overcome some of these barriers that I've listed earlier, like political instability and etc. So I think first you need to really establish this dialogue and consultations with the key local stakeholders, but also at the state level, at the local level, but also at the federal level, which is the dynamic of Somalia. It doesn't make our life easier, but you do have like different players at different level, and you also need to sign up, and this is what we did in this project: sign up a credit-worthy anchor client, and in that case is the United Nations. They have committed to buy electricity from this power plant for the next 10 years, and that makes the project bankable for us. And last point also, you need to debunk this misconception about Somalia and the risk of operating in Somalia. Yeah, there are risks, but there is ways to actually mitigate this risk. And I think this is a big part of like bringing investors and be, as a project developer, able to develop this kind of project. It's like how you change minds of people about Somalia, how you change the narrative about Somalia. And I think this is a point where we have spent a lot of times to convince people that this project is feasible. We have established a very solid framework with the local government through an MOU, where we have set the expectations. Set expectation is pretty key for this project, because the do no harm principle is like still drive the project development. Everyone thinks that because you're there, you will bring electricity to everyone and it's going to be very cheap. This is the ultimate goal, but it's not like in the initial phase what is possible. We have done a lot of research, identified the risk, set up mitigation measures for all of this risk. We have done also a stakeholder engagement, where we have consulted groups, women groups, IDPs, everyone as part also of the environmental and social impact study that we have conducted. But I think it's kind of like a KYC++, in a way that you don't necessarily just like send a questionnaire and ask the people to actually fill that. You need to understand with whom you're going to work in a way that it's you need to make sure that it's not too close to the government, it's not too close to Al-Shabaab, it's not taking side, and that you make sure that you don't jeopardize your entire project because you're actually partnering with the wrong entity. So this has been quite, difficult and complex, time-consuming. We have started the project in as I say, late 2018, and this is pictures from this year. So you can imagine, we had COVID, we had presidential elections, we have change in power of president state in Southwest states where we operate the project, different ministries. It's very time consuming, and it actually had a cost also to the development of the project. So it's not, you can understand why investors and developers are, tend to shy away from these locations. There are good reasons, but I think it's because we do have our backgrounds, I used to live, in Somalia and work there, you know that there is an opportunity and there is a project that can be done. And I think the fact that we do have the UN as an anchor client has helped us to access, international financing. And we are actually talking about private equity, where I didn't get any public, financing for this project. And also guarantees from MIGA, from the World Bank Group. So it's going to be the first time that MIGA will provide guarantees to a project in Somalia. And also sort of like create a platform where we can distribute electricity to everyone. So the power plant will be connected to the UN, to the public buildings of the government in Baidoa, but also to the hospitals. And we are actually looking at partnering with a local company that can actually provide electricity to the communities. But I think it just gives an example that doing this kind of project is possible. Making an investment also in fragile context, it's possible. And I think we're actually, I must say, we are very proud of this. After a few years of development, to have a power plant that will be commissioned in a couple of weeks. inshallah, that this project will show that it's possible to do so. And we're actually replicating this same model in Central African Republic and South Sudan. So I'm going to stop here.
Impressive, very courageous that you're moved into Somalia, and also with a sizable project. I think it will generate a lot of positive impact, and there probably will be a lot of questions on how do you enter in such a context. But I think we need some people that can show the way. So thank you, Kristen, for your intervention and the work that you're doing in Somalia. Maybe Dominique, you've been spearheading the SFG Peace Finance Hub that was just launched. How does that relate to the discussions that we're having right now?
Well, obviously it hugely relates when you look at the testimonies we just heard in relation to any investment you would do linked to the energy transition. Obviously, before I start, I would like to say that I'm wearing two hats today. I'm wearing the hat of Chief Sustainability Officer at the Puri Pictature Etienne, and for Sustainable Finance Geneva, for chairing this Peace Finance Committee that we've just launched with this hub this past Tuesday at Building Bridges. And from both of those hats, there are two important institutions and two important people I would like to thank, and they happen to be on this panel. So that's, first of all, Josina Lackey from TrustWorks, who helped us in the design and content of the Peace Finance Hub for this version V10, which I invite you to go to. It's online. You just go on Sustainable Finance Geneva, Impact Team, Peace Finance Hub, and it will lays out the fundamentals. The fundamentals is to help the financial industry understand that peace is a key element of any investment framework. That's not the case today. The other element is also to help the peace-building community to understand that it's not just about politics, that financing investments have a huge impact in fragile context. So thank you very much to Johannes Schroeder and Peace Nexus, because they came to us 5 years ago. That was 2018, and was 20 years in sustainable finance. All I knew about peace were extreme cases, the Holcim's, the Lafarge Holcim cases of this world, very, very little tips of icebergs. And when Peace Nexus knocked on our door, we were managing a strategy called Buy and Care, where we put as much emphasis on what we buy, but then also the 364 other days, what you can do with your investments and how you can influence it, how you can be a good steward of these investments. We launched probably what was the first fund trying to target this topic of peace. So it's lesser sexy than invest in water or energy, because you cannot invest in peace. You actually invest in companies that have an impact, but maybe don't exactly know their negative impacts, and don't also know the positive opportunities and can rise out of that. And in the past 5 years, Johannes and Josie, they were with us in those engagement meetings with Nestle, with Danone, with L'Oreal, with RWE, big European companies, US companies, PepsiCo, Microsoft, MasterCard, many companies we owned, that at first we thought, okay, very few of them actually have an impact on peace and stability, so okay, let's maybe engage with 2 or 3 of our portfolio companies. And over the years, we realized that 100% of our companies were highly exposed to peace and stability, that their value chain could be completely disrupted in some areas, would go back to conflicts. So that's pretty much how it started, and it's still going on today. And the purpose of this Peace Finance Hub is to be a data repository to explain to the financial industry that our puzzle, the ESG puzzle, the impact puzzle, you name it the way you want, but basically we learned 20 years ago, okay, let's integrate environmental issue, pollution in our portfolios. We learned to do that. And human rights, we learned to incorporate human rights stakeholders. So we moved from capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, and then came climate finance, then comes nature finance. Now the idea is that peace finance is not an ESG and a new thing. It's just that you can't create any of that. No shareholder value, no positive impact on nature and climate, no positive impact on education, on any of the SDGs, no positive impact on human rights if you don't have the good conditions of peace and stability. So that's not a huge fact for anyone in this room, I suppose, but still, what's the connection to our portfolios? You know, when we started this discussion, people told me, yeah, Dominic, that's a nice topic. It's indeed, Geneva is a good place to address it, but, you know, come on, it's just 1% of my portfolio. Maybe some investment I have in Somalia in private equity or private debt. But then the challenge is really as well for the companies, but for us as investment managers to understand that it's our portfolios, obviously the Nestlé's with coffee, with cocoa, the cotton industry. We talked about renewable energy. We see all the materials, the cobalt, the nickel, the chromium. Those are all minerals that are necessary to power our future. There has been a very striking studies also showing the extent to which today you basically cannot produce a magnet without having very strong ties to Myanmar. So when we launched the fund, it was 2018, it was before the coup. I can tell you, when we addressed this topic with the companies, nobody was really talking about this peace issue, and the companies had big eyes. They say, oh, something new. Okay, I'm used to address shareholders talking to me about climate or governance, but not about peace and stability, because companies feel they are neutral. They have trying to be neutral. But as a matter of fact, there is no single dollar of investment anywhere in the world that's neutral. It either contributes to peace and stability or to conflict. And there are tools. There are nation tools that Peace Nexus and TrustWorks are working on to help companies to work on that. As we move along with the Ukraine invasion, we realize peace and stability is a value that is at risk anywhere. We also see with worry what's happening in the United States. This is a good that we need to maintain, and it's quite obvious that it's not just impacting 1% of our portfolios, but 99 and if not 100% of our portfolios. So this data repository, which is, as I said, version 1.0, is only going to grow with you. And I'm really happy because I see here people from the peace building industry or sector that I've learned to know in the past years. I see people from the financial industry. We need to work together to build a bridge. That's a pretty good setting. And to translate all that research, all that know-how that foundation, institution, academics have been working on in Geneva and abroad on peace building, on the interaction of peace building and business, to translate that to us. The financial industry need to be able to work with those tools. So SFG will help to catalyze, will help to collect this information, maybe sometimes translate it in our word, in our jargons, with our alphabet soups and ESG and impact and allocation and exit strategies and engagements. And then, of course, we need the support for this hub of the peace-building community to also help us in realizing impact financing has a huge impact in fragile countries. And our investments, not just direct investments in projects like we've seen, which are obviously extremely important, but the indirect impact of the value chains in pretty much any companies we invest. So please join us, go to the website, and any one of you who believes, okay, I can contribute because I've studied, I know, either from the financial industry or the peace building community. We need your inputs, we need your research. We'll try to shed light on it and make sure that it gets integrated in our portfolio management. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you, Dominique. And I think we're, as a peace building foundation, extremely happy to see that what started as a peace-themed equity engagement fund, which already was a bit of a strange beast, is now moving into a movement, a Geneva-based movement. So we will continue to support it where we can. But all this work is not happening in isolation. Also in Brussels, there's quite some additional attention being given to operations in fragile and conflict-affected settings. So maybe, Josie, can you tell me a little bit what's happening on the legislative side?
Sure, thanks, Johannes. So, as some of you may know, the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is currently under negotiation. We hope that the EU will conclude these negotiations either at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year. And actually, in June of this year, the EU Parliament passed an amendment as part of the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, Amendment number 37, and there are a few other connected amendments that would actually make it mandatory for companies that have either operations or supply chains in fragile and conflict-affected areas, or what they call conflict-affected and high-risk areas, to conduct heightened conflict-sensitive due diligence. So this would be the first time that something like that has been passed. It would be the first time that it becomes mandatory. And so this could potentially be huge for our field. There are, of course, antecedents. These type of processes are already mentioned in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that many businesses and investors are very aware of. The need for heightened due diligence was then reiterated in the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights in 2020, but this is the first time that it would actually potentially become mandatory. Closer, sorry. It sounds loud to me. So what does this mean for companies, practically speaking? It means that they would have to do more than human rights due diligence, which many companies are doing, not all of them, but most responsible companies are doing human rights due diligence. If this becomes mandatory, in addition to human rights due diligence, they would have to incorporate conflict analysis, stakeholder engagement. This means that the objective is to really understand the conflict dynamics in which you operate and to understand the interaction effects between a company's operations and supply chains and the conflict dynamics, with the aim of trying to see, is my company in any way causing conflict, contributing to conflict, or linked to conflict? And if it is, what can I do about it? Are there mitigation measures that I can put in place, or do I need to find a way to exit responsibly from this conflict-affected context? So in terms of what this means for companies and how they can start preparing, I think there are many things that companies can do. The first question that we tend to get from the companies that we work with is, what is a conflict-affected context? Which countries and regions are we actually talking about? And as you can see from the World Bank Index that my colleague presented, that's one interpretation. Unfortunately, there are many indices to draw upon. But so I really encourage companies first to really understand what this means. And I think it's actually very important to distinguish between conflict-affected and fragile, because conflict has standing in international law. And so in conflict contexts, companies need to care about things like sanctions and international humanitarian law, international criminal law, their interactions with non-state armed groups, etc. So conflict is really your starting point, and we know which contexts are conflict affected. You can use RULAC, the Rule of Law in Armed Conflict Index, based here in Geneva. It's an excellent resource. So that's the first thing that companies need to do. The second is to make sure that conflict is integrated into your policy frameworks. So right now, most companies have a human rights policy, but the majority of these human rights policies are not at all conflict-proof. They do not recognize the need for different types of approaches in conflict contexts to those that we use in non-conflict contexts. Companies also need to put in place governance processes to dictate and help them decide entry decisions, exit decisions, and adjustment decisions that they need to make to their operations or to their supply chains. And then, of course, in the most high-risk context, so the conflict-affected context where they have either operations or supply chains, they need to make sure that they are conducting heightened human rights due diligence or conflict sensitivity. Happy to go into the details about the differences between all these terms, perhaps afterwards. But I think there are a few just quick additional points to mention. The first is that it's not sector-specific. I think we often have in our minds that only certain sectors are really exposed to conflict risks. Any sector, any goods or services have the potential to contribute inadvertently to conflict. Of course, some sectors are more exposed than others, and I think that anything to do with the energy transition is a highly exposed sector. And what I would like to see is that the conversation on climate and on energy transitions is going hand in hand with the discussion on peace and conflict, because the energy transition requires access to land and water for solar, hydro, etc. And land and water are normally the two resources that are really at the heart of most conflicts on which we work. These are really the issues for which people are fighting. So of course we need to make sure that conflict sensitivity is integrated into these projects. But moreover, any transition anything to do with the energy transition also involves conflict minerals. I think there are 17 or so minerals associated with the energy transition. The majority of them are found in conflict-affected contexts. So we really need to see these two agendas going hand in hand more and more. So what does this mean for investors? And I will stop there. Investors like PPT really have such a huge amount of power and influence, and we would really encourage investors to use that power and influence, to have an active engagement strategy when they're engaging with their companies, to make sure that companies are aware of conflict risks, irrespective of the regulation. Whether or not the regulation goes through, these are risks that companies need to care about. If you're a responsible company, you're ideally not waiting to see if the legislation comes through or not. You're acting on this because you know that conflict risks can damage your business, but also because there's a high risk that your business can inadvertently contribute to conflict dynamics. So investors, I think, have a pivotal role in making sure that this is on the agenda of the companies in their portfolio companies, and that they are consistently asking for greater transparency on where companies are operating, where they're supplying from, and ensuring that they're putting in place heightened human rights due diligence and conflict sensitivity into their policies, frameworks, and processes. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
No, thank you, Josie. So I think through all intervention, it became clear that conflict sensitivity is coming your way. So better start preparing yourself. And also we encourage to move into these difficult contexts. I have a lot of questions, but I want to prioritize questions from the room. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. I think there's a button on the microphone, and maybe introduce yourself and specify to whom you would like to pose the question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kimani Isaac, and my question is for whoever on the panel sees fit to answer. But first, I just wanted to share a resource that I think might be useful for the room. There's the Institute for Economics and Peace, which has a Business and Peace report in 2021, which states that the global economic impact of violence was 14.4 trillion USD in 2020. And if we could be 10% more peaceful, the savings would be equivalent to $1.4 trillion. So my question is, when it comes to accountability for the organizations and the private sector where their value chains benefit from FCS states, how do we think about creating accountability within the private sector beyond policy, but amongst the business community? Thank you.
Big question. Who would like to volunteer to answer that on the accountability? Dominique, please.
All right. I see everyone fighting for answer the question, and it's of course a very difficult one. And for the financial industry, you could put that into nature, climate, governance, and it would be the same answer. For me, accountability goes through transparency, first of all. So whenever you say you intend to research, or when you're an investor to invest and you have a fund and you have a strategy, the most important thing is to be transparent on what you achieved, which is not new in the financial industry. There are so-called fact sheets. You promise super performance, and then at the end of the year you show and you say, all right, this was a bad year last year, this year is better. And so you need to basically do the same. And no matter if you claim to be working on peace, on water, on equity, on debt, on gold. I don't know, the ones who maybe just attended the previous panel, very interesting, showing the intersection here of nature, peace, and economic development. Also, what we need to do is those data that you publish, that's, I think, $2,200 per person per year. Just imagine what that represents. And I think it's 12-13% of global GDP that's wiped out. So business have a vested interest to promote peace and stability, but we don't know the data. and we feel dispowered. Companies, they promote neutrality, non-involvement with governments. We know that's not the case. Otherwise, lobbying wouldn't be a word. So the mindset needs to change, and investors need to put carte sur table, as we say in French, and say there is a clear economic and business impact of your activities. Face it, don't hide it, and as we do the same, is also promote to avoid the negative impacts and promote potentially even in stabilizing and positive impacts in some countries. So the transparency is very important as an accountability, and then the second is the education. That's the Peace Finance Hub, because if the clients, if the end owners, very often we forget that as an investment firm, it's not every client that comes to us and say, I want to invest, make money, but also want to make sure I don't destroy the planet and its resources. It's not the case. So we need to have clients to understand, private and institutional investors, that their money, what they invest in today, determines the lives of what's going to happen in 5 to 10 years. The products, the technology, but then also, of course, the infrastructure. So if they understand that and they have transparency in the product, at least from the financial industry perspective, then maybe we have advanced, but we are far from that, unfortunately.
Thank you. Maybe you're still remaining with some questions, but maybe at the end of the room, you would like to come in? Please.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Gregory Connor from UNDP, and I have a question. Congratulations, first of all, on the launch of the Peace Finance Hub. It's great to see. And I was really happy to see as well that you're mentioning that aside from this goal in peace finance as an approach of really prioritizing the minimization of these risks that we're talking about to investees from investors, that there might be, as you just mentioned, Dominique, these opportunities for investors to encourage investments that are really identifying avenues that contribute to peace. When we heard on the panel, we heard more of the context of fragile and conflict-affected countries. We heard a little bit about how different types of crisis financing might lead to stabilization, but I wonder if there are any experiences that you could share that have more purpose-driven peace impacts embedded into them, either deliberately or that could have happened through the business process. Thank you.
Maybe, do you want to answer that, or maybe Kristen on I think the Cube Energy has a peace purpose in its DNA.
Yeah, I mean, I think SDG 7 is more like the driving force beyond Cube, in a way that we want to improve energy access in these locations, and I think it's part of our DNA, as you said. But I think, of course, you need to attract private investors. You need to also have a bankable project. So I think it would be unfair to say it's just it's only the fact that we are in conflict-affected countries, or that we want to change things there, that investors actually are coming into these projects. I think they're definitely a commercial a rationale beyond this, and I think they are most of the investors that we are talking with, they're lacking bankable projects. I think the markets for other countries that are more emerging markets in Tanzania, Kenya, Ghana, etc. I think there is already a lot of projects going on. There is a lot of money flowing there, but I think in countries like of course Somalia and Central African Republic, there is not much happening there. I mean, for instance, in car, the market has been liberalized in 2005. And we are about to sign the first, contract with the government as a first independent power producer. So even if there is, all the conditions there, of course, people tend to, not go there. And I think maybe that's how you can call it, maybe a peace component to that. We're trying to make maybe our niche market, but we are really looking at where there is a need and where people are maybe a bit more scared to go.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe also we could continue this discussion for a bit longer than an hour, I think. But maybe one more question from the room, and then I think we need to close. Please.
Okay. Hi, I'm Mila Boyer. I'm director of Rios Partners. I really appreciate this conversation. I think there's one stakeholder group that we haven't mentioned very much, which is the local business entrepreneurs. And we're talking about the investors, we're talking about multinational companies, we're talking about local communities. And I'm wondering how you see the role of the local business entrepreneurs. And I'm partly asking that because I'm currently supporting a group of local business entrepreneurs in Cyprus who are really doing business across the dividing line, who find that the conflict is bad for business, and that business can help overcome the conflict, but they're navigating this piece a bit of not necessarily wanting to get involved in the politics too much, and they're also seeing that climate change is bad for business and that the conflict is exacerbating climate change. So they have a very clear interest in this and they have a really important role to play. And I'm wondering, how you see the possibilities of strengthening that role and how we can encourage that in this kind of systemic change that we're talking about.
No, thank you. Important question. Josie, you want to?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think the issue of SMEs and the impact that they can have on peace and stability is such an important question, and it's one that's definitely understudied in comparison with the impact of multinational corporations. We actually recently put out a report, Trustworks did in partnership with Interpeace, on the role of SME facilities in fragile conflict-affected settings. I'm happy to share it with you. But one of the major findings was that currently none of the SME facilities that we identified in fragile conflict-affected settings are applying the principles of conflict sensitivity, like zero, which is quite disturbing because we know that an individual SME is not going to have any meaningful impacts on peace and stability. They're too small, other than the medium-sized on the larger end, but the majority of micro, small to medium-sized businesses have almost no impacts on conflict dynamics. So we're not expecting individual SMEs to put in place conflict sensitivity, heightened human rights due diligence policies and practices in the same way that we're expecting multinationals to. However, when you take a large group of SMEs, they have a lot of impact on peace and stability and on conflict dynamics. So SME facilities, those actors that are working with a large number of SMEs, we know that they're actually having huge impacts on peace and stability. And it's quite concerning when we consider the amount of money that DFIs are pumping into SME facilities and the huge number of actors that are involved in this space. And so to answer your question, I think what can help is that those like you who are working with SMEs can actually really help them because they are often really on the front line of conflict and violence. And unfortunately, they're not seen yet by the peace-building community as being beneficiaries of the type of support that peace-building actors offer. And I think that we would really seek to encourage that, and we have several initiatives in this space, to actually support SMEs to really deal with the conflict dynamics that they're confronted with. And what we know is that when you actually provide SMEs with support to connect them with one another and to help them build alliances and to help them lobby and to advocate for policy change or whatever else that they need, that can actually have fundamental impacts on peace and stability. And so I think there is a lot that can be done with SMEs as a group rather than as individuals. I also wanted to come quickly back to this question that was raised before about peace impacts, if I can, just very quickly, because I think it's such an important point and it's central to this question of what is peace finance. And I think you can only claim that your investment is having impacts on peace if you are actually addressing the causes, drivers, or triggers of conflict, which requires you to do a conflict assessment. I think we should not confuse positive impacts with impacts on peace, and I see that a lot. And I think we really need to push back on that. These two things are not the same. And that's why we have framed this peace finance agenda in this way, because the majority of investors are not there. They're not currently minimizing the negative impacts on their investments on conflict and fragility. As long as they're not doing that, it doesn't make sense to talk about maximizing peace. I think it's an agenda that's really easy to jump on because it's way easier to sell, right? If we'd called this the anti-conflict peace hub, it just doesn't sound very good. peace finance is sequential. We have to first minimize the negative impacts. Once we've got good at that, then let us talk about how we can maximize impacts on peace and stability. But the two go hand in hand. As long as you're having negative impacts on conflict, it's impossible for you to have positive impacts on peace. So let us sequence this discussion and also sequence how we go about supporting both investors and multinationals and SMEs to actually make change happen.
No, thank you, Josie, for this powerful intervention. I think we unfortunately need to close. We're running out of time. I think there's a lot more to be discussed, and we will stay here. But I want to be mindful also for the people that are joining us online. I want to join another session. So let's discuss. Please come forward if you want to discuss further. I think renewable energy, investing in renewable energy in fragile state can have enormous positive social economic impacts, but please do it by clearly understanding the context and do it in a very conflict sensitive way. And I think that has been stressed by all panelists, so please join me in thanking them for their contribution today and wish you a very good conference.